Let me just say I'm not going to talk about the politics of the last couple of weeks or months, even though I do believe that the topic today sort of does go into that area, because I think that in the coverage of our politics, certainly in the last 6 months, and probably dating back to 2010, there's been a kind of betrayal of readers and viewers and people who consume our journalism. And I believe that. Read the piece and you'll see what I mean. But I do want to talk today about journalism and betrayal and the journalist, and I guess the non-fiction writer as a betrayer. And I want to talk about that because I wrote a piece for the Griffith Review, which is basically about this issue and about a piece of research that we did at the University of Melbourne Centre for Advanced Journalism, which looked at the way the media covered the bushfires of the Black Saturday fires and the way the people who were covered felt about being in the media spotlight and being exposed in the way they were by the journalists that interviewed them and filmed them and talked to them. And in doing that research, one of the questions that came up was, for me, and it's something that's come up over time, over a long period of time that I've been a journalist, is what's the deal between the people you interview and what you write? Is there some sort of contract? Are they giving you informed consent? And that's obviously a big issue when you're dealing with people who have been through great trauma. When journalists arrive at a say a fireground after the one like Black Saturday, and they are immediately talking to survivors within hours of the event that has so devastated their lives and so traumatised. What's the deal there? What's going on? Are those people in a position to give informed consent to being interviewed? Do they know what they're getting themselves into? Is their goal in agreeing to be interviewed, even if they can give some sort of consent, are they consenting to what the journalists will end up doing with their stories? Because what will happen is their stories will become the journalists' stories. It is no longer their stories. There's been a transaction taken place, and the journalist takes ownership of that story. And people will wake up in the morning when they see this in a newspaper and they'll realise that it's not their story. It's not what they agreed to or what they think they agreed to. And it's inevitable that it'll be that way. So there's always a kind of form of betrayal in that interaction between journalists and their subjects, non-fiction writers and their subjects. Let me just give you a quote from Janet Malcolm in her book, The Journalist and the Murderer, in which she says this. It's a famous quote. She's a great writer, but this quote has been analysed and all sorts of stuff has been done on it by journalists. I think there's probably been PhD theses on this, and this is what she said. Every journalist who is not too stupid or too full of himself to notice what is going on knows that what he does is indefensible. He is a kind of confidence man, preying on people's vanity, ignorance, or loneliness, gaining their trust and betraying them without remorse. That's pretty powerful stuff. When I read it the first time, I thought, yes, the only thing I'd say is that I have sometimes felt remorse. So the remorse line I'd like to qualify. But it is powerful and it does raise lots of issues. Here's a quote that is less well known. I'm sure some of you have read Joan Didion's non-fiction work, and there's a great collection of her essays of the 60s called Slouching Towards Bethlehem. In the introduction to that book, certainly the edition that I've got at home, Joan Didion, it's a sort of throwaway line, says, of course writers are always selling somebody out. And she says no more about it, except just preceding that, she says, I guess one of the things about me that made me able to get into situations where people told me things or did things that I could observe was that I was so unobtrusive. I was so introverted. I sort of disappeared when I sat there with people or watched things that were going on, so that they forgot what I actually was. I was a writer. I wasn't part of what was going on. I was going to write about what was going on. Now that rung a bell with me too. That is one of the great skills of journalists, if they're good. They are unobtrusive when they're investigating a story. They're not pushing the story along. They're not pushing people. What they really want is for people to forget they're there. Even though the ethics of journalism is that you've got to identify yourself as a journalist, but the real thing that you're doing, because you want to get at some truth, is that you want people to forget that you're a journalist. That doesn't mean you become a player with them, but what you become is, I haven't worked as a therapist, but you become a kind of therapist. What you do is listen. What you give people the opportunity to do is talk to you. Without interruption, with total concentration from you, focused entirely on them. Now, very few people have that experience in their lives. Most people's experience of conversations with people is that the other person wants to tell you what's going on, what's happening to them, rather than listen to what's going on with you. Now, writers can't do that. Good writers, and don't want to do that, are into listening. I'll just give you a small example of something that happened to me. In the 80s, I did, times were different and journalists were given time to do stories. I did a series of articles on the Fitzroy police. Now, doing that series of articles, I got permission through the Chief Commissioner, and it would never happen today, I don't think, to spend 3 weeks at the Fitzroy police station. I could do whatever I wanted. I could sit there all day, I could sit there at night, I could watch interrogations, I could do whatever I wanted to do. When I came to the station, all the coppers were incredibly suspicious and really worried about what was going to happen here. I didn't come with a notebook. I did, of course, they knew I was a journalist. I just sat around and listened. Occasionally I asked somebody, "What are you doing today?" Then I got into saying, "Can I come out with you? I'll just sit in the back seat of your car and I won't say a word." Well, over time, over a week or so, I could see these coppers forgot that I was a journalist. And they were, because I was so open to it, they were telling me all sorts of things about their lives, about what they were doing. Now, why was I there at the police station? There was a reason, and they knew the reason, because there'd been a lot of reporting from the Aboriginal community in Fitzroy that the coppers were racist and biased and were giving Aboriginal people a really hard time. That's why I was there, and they knew that's what I was there. A week into my being there, a couple of police started talking about the problems they had with the Aboriginal community. And they talked about Aboriginal people in the most demeaning way. They called them bungs, for instance. That was a term that everybody used. And they weren't just bungs, but there was a kind of adjective in front of it, which starts with F. And I thought that this is the story. And these coppers are telling me all this, knowing I'm a journalist, but I realised they had forgotten that I was a journalist. Now, I don't think it was for me to tell them that, "Oh, hang on a minute, you shouldn't be saying that. I'm a journalist. You shouldn't be telling me these things. I'm not your friend, nor am I your therapist. My interests are different than your interests here. And if I've done this well, I have got you to the point of forgetting what my interests are and giving me what I need without actually meaning to." Now, of course, once my stories were published, the police were up in arms. They felt betrayed. People down at the Fitzroy police station, 3 weeks is a long time to spend with people, thought I was their friend, thought I was on their side, whatever that side was, thought they were telling me things that I would use differently, thought that I wouldn't focus on their attitudes to the Aboriginal community in Fitzroy. So they felt betrayed, and I do accept it was a form of betrayal. And what Joan Didion, what Janet Malcolm said is true. I had used my skills to basically get people to tell me things that they probably didn't want me to know, and that once they did that, when it was published, they would feel betrayed. But I think that is what journalism is partly about, and I think that's true whether it's the sort of work that I did, or whether it's the work that journalists did in the aftermath of the Black Saturday bushfires. We interviewed 30 survivors of those fires about how they felt about the coverage. Now, I'll tell you a couple of things about that. Most of them couldn't remember that they had been interviewed by journalists. They were clearly so traumatised at the time that they couldn't remember. The second thing is that they did vaguely remember was that they desperately needed someone to talk to. And journalists are kind of first responders. They're there on the spot. And if they're good at it, they are good listeners. So people wanted to talk, but they didn't necessarily want to talk to journalists who were then going to use their stories, what they said, to create their own reality of what had gone on. So people felt, did they feel betrayed? I think people have become so cynical about the way the media operates and journalists operate that most of them thought what happened to them was exactly what they thought would happen to them. Some of them felt like it had an enormous impact on their families, the coverage. 2 years later, they still weren't over it. One woman told us that being photographed smiling had destroyed her life, that her neighbours, her family, her friends, people who had lost husbands and wives and children saw this photograph of her smiling and thought what you can imagine what they thought. So we have an impact. Journalists are involved in taking someone's story and making it their own. You know, when you see the fuss that happened between Paul Keating and Don Watson over Don Watson's book about the Keating years, I mean, one of the things that struck me immediately and probably struck you, it's a great book for a start. And I reckon that in many ways, the greater the book, the bigger the betrayal. And what do I mean by that? The greater the book, the more the writer has made it his or her story. And of course, what Keating felt was that Don Watson had stolen his story. He had taken his story and stolen it and made it his own. Now, Don Watson kind of wrote pieces about this, that he didn't really, he did this, he did that. In the end, he kind of admitted, this was my story. This wasn't Paul Keating's story. If Paul Keating wants to write his story about what went on, go and write his story. But this was my story, and I own it. And it's my take on what happened. It's my story it's my history, not Paul Keating's. And he might feel like it was stolen from him, but it's my story. This reminds me of a story that and I think this is true about journalism. I think it's true about all non-fiction writing. Helen Garner sitting in the front here. I'm going to say something about you, Helen. We once had a conversation, and Helen said to me she had done a workshop with people who wanted to write, and she said, I hope you don't mind me saying this, Helen, that one of the things that struck her about the pieces and their feelings of these people just setting out to be writers was that they were fearful. There was fear in their stories. Now, Helen might have a different meaning of what that meant than I have, but what I think it meant to me was that people, they couldn't have articulated it this way, were frightened of betraying the people that they were writing about. that they were going to reveal things that were going to be hurtful, that the people won't have seen that way, that they'll feel betrayed. And the fact is that that fear is a real fear, but if you're going to be a real writer, if you're going to write things that are true for you and therefore are true for your readers, you've got to get over that fear. You've got to believe that the story is the most important thing. How good it is, how nuanced it is, how compelling it is, how true it is, that's what's important. And the betrayal, the sort of betrayal that I've talked about, comes with that. I want to finish with a little story, because it's not about just about non-fiction. I think it's also about fiction writing. A little story that has stuck in my head for years. Norman Mailer, before he became a blowhard and whatever he became, I think he was a really good writer, and he wrote a little story called The Notebook. And some of you might have read it. He was a young writer when he wrote this. It was published in a book called Advertisements for Myself, and it's one of the, I think it's the best little story in the book, where he describes this young writer who's walking down the street with his girlfriend. They've been together for some time. Out of the blue, from nowhere, he says, the girlfriend says, "I've had enough of you and I want to break up. I don't want to talk about this much." But he says, "But you can't just walk away. You've got to tell me some things about, why you're doing this. This has come from nowhere." So she says a few things, and some of them are about how self-obsessed he is and other things. And then they part. She says, "Goodbye, this is the end, I'm never going to see you again." As she walks down the street, he takes out a notebook and writes down everything that she said. Now, that's what's going to happen with that. This is going to be transformed by the writer into something else. The writer has both experienced something, but has also been a writer. And I would imagine that once he wrote this story, his girlfriend would have felt betrayed. Instead of him focusing on what was going on with her, he was somewhere else doing something else. He was stealing her story. He was stealing her words. He had actually asked her to explain what was going on so he could write it down and use it. So I think Janet Malcolm is kind of right. But I also think it's interesting that while she said he in that quote, I think she means he or she, and if she's right, completely right, and there's nowhere else to go with that, I would have thought Janet Malcolm would stop writing non-fiction, would stop writing altogether, but she didn't. She kept going, and she still writes, and writes terrific stuff. So yes, it's true there's betrayal involved, and I think writers, certainly journalists, need to be aware of this. I think journalists need to know more about the impact they have on people that they write about, and I think that that's a very important thing. But the fact is that in the end, journalists, non-fiction writers, writers of all sorts, are going to do this sort of thing, and they're going to want to be judged, and they're going to do it because they believe the story is important, because they have to write, because writing is what they do. And the story ultimately, if the story is no good, well, the betrayal wasn't worth it. If the story is really, really good and true and nuanced, then it has been worth it, and we have to live with the cost of that. Thank you.